From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. And today we're going to be talking about Track 2 dialogue. To discuss what it is, how it works, and MEI's involvement in Middle East dialogue, I'm joined today by Randa and Paul Salem. Randa is a senior fellow and director of MEI's Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program, and Paul is MEI's president. Randa, Paul, thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Welcome
good
back
to
to
be
the
with
program.
you. Good to be with you both.
Thank you, Alistair. It's good to be back on the podcast and good to be on the podcast with Randa.
Indeed, indeed. Randa, let's start with you. For our listeners who might not be as familiar with Track 2 dialogue, can you briefly explain what it is and how it works and how it differs from the other tracks like 1 and 1.5?
So Track 1 diplomacy is official negotiations between governments. The term Track 2 diplomacy was defined in 1981 by a former diplomat, Joseph Monville, who defined it as unofficial informal interactions between members of adversarial groups or nations who meet together to discuss strategies, to influence public opinion, and to organize and resources, material and human, that can help in one way or another in resolving the conflict. And then you have Track 1.5, which is in the field defined as back channel diplomacy, and it could be one of many ways. It could be members of governments meeting together with the help of a unofficial third party, and they do that because they don't want outsiders to know that they are meeting, so they do it in secret. Like, for example, what happened between Iran and the United States with the help of the Omanis leading to the JCPOA. Or it could be like what we do at the Middle East Institute, which is we bring a mix of current officials, former officials, and senior experts together to discuss issues dealing whether with regional cooperation or the solution to the conflict in Syria or means of de-escalating the conflict in Yemen. And so often Track 2 and Track 1.5 are organized by what we call outside third-party intervention, whereas in the case of the Middle East Institute, the dialogue are organized by people from the region, meaning Paul Salem and myself. So in that respect, it's what we call an insider-outsider intervention.
And why would, for example, a country decide to pursue one of these tracks versus another? What are the kind of upsides or downsides of the different tracks?
Usually, countries do not decide to pursue tracks. Countries' governments pursue Track 1, which is official diplomacy. But you have people in countries, former usually officials, former diplomats, who decide to engage in Track 1.5. Like, for example, President Carter, when he tried to mediate the conflict between the United States and North Korea. That's what we define as Track 1.5. Although he was a U.S. president, but at the time he was not a president. He was a private citizen and a former official. Or other diplomats when they decide to engage in helping mediate conflict, for example, like the one I took part in Tajikistan in the midst of its civil war in the 1990s, where we had a U.S.-Russian group, half of whom were former diplomats, coming together and working with members of the Tajikistani factions, the opposing factions, and helping with conflict resolution. So why Track 1.5, Track 2? Often when there are no communication channels open between governments, so Track 1.5, Track 2 can help in establishing some communication lines. But also you have cases where you have a Track 1 process that has been blocked. For example, let's take the case of Syria. In Syria right now, you have an official Track 1 process, which is the Geneva process. It has been blocked for a long time, partly because the government of Syria has not been interested in entering this negotiation in good faith. And so what you have is you have Track 2 processes involving Syrians from the opposition, some who are close to the regime but not necessarily part of the regime, coming together and brainstorming ideas about constitutional amendments, security sector reform. So these are some of the cases where you have Track 2, Track 1.5 helping in active conflict situations.
What are the circumstances under which Track 2 is most likely to be successful?
It differs, the literature and the difference between Track 2 today versus Track 2, let's say when I started with this field in 1990, is that now we have a lot of research and data accumulated. So we know what works, what does not work, and what are the conditions that are conducive to it working. I think the primary condition, in my opinion, is that you have a common base of interest among the parties. If there is no such commonalities of interest, then I don't see a track 2 or even a track 1 can work. So maybe track 1 can eventually create interest by what we call expanding the pie, adding resources to incentivize the parties to enter negotiation. Track 2 cannot do that. Track 1 can do that. But when there is not commonality of interest, at least something to build on as common ground for the talk or the negotiation in the case of track 1, it's very difficult for a track 2 process to work. The second, I think you need to have a track 1 that has started. Track 2 is hard by itself to operate, and so when you don't have any kind of official process, whether it is negotiation or whether it's talks that have already started and, as in the many cases, have been blocked, and then track 2 can come in, try to create new ideas, test new ideas, create some momentum in the public arena that can push the official parties toward negotiation. So basically, in summary, I think the two most important conditions is that you have a commonality of interest, some base of interest between the parties. Second is that you have had a track 1 process, or you have an active track 1, and then track 2 can either help by keeping the momentum for track 1 in case the track 1 has been stopped, or by developing new ideas that can eventually be fed into the track 1. That's the second condition. And the third is that, protracted conflict that have been active, whether it is overtly active or latently active for a long time, are more amenable to a track 2 intervention, especially a sustained track 2 interaction, than short-term conflicts.
Paul, switching over to you, looking at the state of diplomacy in the region, where are there the kind of greatest failures and the greatest need for this sort of work?
Well, I think, the absence of effective diplomacy in the region partly is linked to the politics of the region, because in the countries themselves, there isn't a belief internally in dialogue or coming to common agreement. There is an authoritarian approach generally, which looks at force and dominance as the way of governing one's society. There also is not a belief in a liberal order. And what I mean by that, the basic definition of a liberal order is the belief that actually members of society and groups within society could actually coexist peacefully without violence and without domination or force. That kind of innovation, which came out of Western Europe eventually and became known as sort of the liberal view of politics, is a very fundamental shift in how societies look at themselves. And the Arab countries maybe are struggling with that, from the first Arab Spring to maybe what we can call maybe a second Arab Spring, but the response has generally been authoritarian. That applies as well to international relations, which after World War II were more or less built on a liberal vision of the international order, that actually countries can coexist. They don't have to be empires. They don't have to be conquering each other, that they can coexist within a system of international law and states' rights and responsibilities. That approach in terms of the regional relations in the Middle East has also not been taken in by any of the main players. Israel hasn't seen it that way. The Arab countries generally haven't seen it that way. Iran didn't see it that way with its revolution that it sought to change the region. So beyond the fact that there actually is not very much active diplomacy in the Middle East, there actually isn't really the fundamental belief that a regional order can be built on coexistence and some kind of rules of the region. So the deficit is profound. We see that in a number of major crisis areas. Obviously, right now, relations between Iran, certainly Iran and Israel, Iran and the U.S., Iran and the Arab countries. We've seen it in previous episodes between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and its neighbors. Maybe there's some movement between some Arab countries and Israel. So it's a region really without effective diplomacy at all. Now that makes, maybe as Randa was mentioning, makes track two diplomacy both more necessary maybe, but also more challenging. That, as Randa said, an effective track two effort to bear results ideally would plug into a track 1.5 or track 1. But in the absence of track 1, it's also more necessary that those relationships be built, that links be created between societies or former officials who are at least close to the governments, to build those relationships and maintain those relationships at a time when the governments are not talking to each other. That is important both as relationship building, but also as idea creation and alternative futures creation. Today, maybe Arabs and Iranians can't imagine a future when they're at peace. It's a failure of imagination. Like Egypt and Israel could not imagine in the 60s that they would ever be at peace. But you got to imagine it before it happens. And hence, track two efforts are partly relationship building, but maybe more importantly, they are an attempt to imagine together a different future that can begin to seep into the thinking of leaders, and that they at some point dare to do something other than prosecuting conflict as we've done.
Randa, on that point, how much of track two, as you see it, is about building the relationships versus imagining the ideas versus kind of building constituencies potentially for future ideas?
I think it's all of this to be, and that's what a successful track two would do, is definitely building relationship among what I call influential citizens, and that goes into how the party or the institution organizing track two selects participants. It's very important to select people who have, on one hand, access to decision makers, as Paul said, who can relate some of the ideas that are generated in a track two setting to decision makers and help bring these ideas into an official track one process. But at the same time, you want people who have the kind of mindsets and are open and not dogmatic to engage in exploration and imagination of what doesn't exist now. So it takes really a special kind of person to be an ideal track two participant. And we at the Middle East Institute, we are always trying to bring in new participants to the table who can meet this criteria while also keeping the same core of participants in our initiatives, because we believe in a sustained dialogue process, bringing the same people over and over, but injecting new voices as you go. I think that's one, the importance of exploring ideas. But often part of track two is also testing ideas that are in a track one process, being floated in a track one process. And some of the parties want to test them. For example, we have a US-Russia dialogue on the Middle East. And in 2017, there were some ideas being floated under the Astana format, which doesn't include the Americans, and about de-escalation zones and all of this. And so the Russian participants in our track two process brought some of these ideas to explore them with their American counterparts in this track two setting. And we have a discussion about these ideas. And so it's the idea creation, testing ideas, and more importantly, also creating a constituency with the participants that believes in a future that is different from the present, but also creating people with new skills of negotiation, of analysis, often that we see happen with track two.
Paul, taking a step back, when people think about what think tanks do, this probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind. It's not as visible, maybe, and the outputs aren't quite as tangible as they are if you're doing a policy brief or a report. Why is this work important for a think tank to be doing, and particularly so in the case of the Middle East?
It's very important for think tanks to do because it needs to be done. And if governments are not able to do it, think tanks who are more members of civil society have the opportunity, maybe you could say the obligation, to try and to enter in that space. It's also not certainly unique to the Middle East. Efforts in Europe were, even in the foundation of Europe during the middle of World War II, there were some visionary leaders, both French and German, who imagined a different Europe. And were it not for their imagination and their thinking, the idea of a European Union would never have emerged and peace wouldn't have come to Europe. Similar efforts were made with the OSCE the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to de-escalate relations between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc in Europe at the time of the Cold War. That organization still exists, and we actually held our last meeting in Vienna in cooperation with the OSCE to learn from their experience. So I think it's not unnatural for a think tank to do it. They often have that mix of thinkers as well as ex-officials and experts, so it's the right mix. They also usually have pretty good connections to the governments in the countries they are in. So I think it's a natural thing to do. The Middle East Institute itself has been doing this for many, many years under the leadership of Randa, and we continue to find it an extremely valuable thing that we do. It is done, yes, generally quietly, because sometimes publicity might hamper what it does. We also visit the capitals, whether it's in Ankara or Riyadh or Tehran or Moscow or DC or Brussels or Berlin, to carry these messages and to try to, have more leverage in the process.
And obviously, as Paul alluded to, the kind of nature of this work is inherently kind of quieter than some other kinds. But what can you tell us about what MEI is doing in this area?
Well, right now we have 2 initiatives in Track 2, and I would say Track 1.5, because in some cases it involves current officials. So we have the Middle East Dialogue, which focuses on imagining a different future for the Middle East, particularly focused on regional cooperation in the Middle East. And that brings people from the Arab region, Turkey, Iran, and then with very light Western footprint. And by Western, I mean American, Russian, Chinese, and European. But from the beginning, it was conceived as a dialogue by people from the region, for people in the region, and often to be conducted in the region. And that was the original intent of the dialogue. And it continues and meets twice a year. But as Paul said, Track 2 dialogue by themselves are good. But also what happens in between meetings is equally important, whether it is publishing ideas, like here at MEI, many of the scholars do, but also carrying these ideas into the official spheres through either direct meetings with the officials in governments or by, through media. Because again, how diplomacy is being conducted today is different from how diplomacy was conducted 20, 30 years ago. Social media platforms, trying to popularize these ideas that emerge in Track 2 settings into the public arena as much as possible is extremely important. That's one Track 2 dialogue that we have been doing now for some time. The other one, which is more recent, it's a US-Russia dialogue on the Middle East, started in 2016. And from the beginning, it was conceived to focus on Syria, because Syria was the one arena where, on one hand, there is a lot of a competition, between the United States and Russia, but at the same time, it offers an opportunity for some cooperation, limited, tactical cooperation on certain issues, be it de-escalation, ceasefire, or easing humanitarian assistance, which all of these have been hard to accomplish. And recently, we have also been, broaching the idea of counterterrorism, because that's another arena also where United States and Russia, despite the tense situation right now between the two countries, have common interests, in dealing and tackling. And so these are the 2 dialogues that we have been focusing on, and we are now in the process of exploring 2 additional dialogue, which I think when they are ripe and ready to be launched, we'll be talking about them.
Are there any particularly noteworthy success stories that you can share from the past few years?
Yes. I mean, look, as somebody who has been doing Track 2 for a long time, I'm always very reluctant when I'm asked this question by you or in other fora, in public fora, and by donors, to claim causal relationship, i.e. to say our meeting that discussed topic A led to a solution on topic A, solution X on topic A. I think it's very hard because on any policy issues, you have so many entry points and you have so many actors, official and unofficial, that are working on solution for these policy issues. And our Track 2 or Track 1.5 is one of these actors and intervention that are working on this. However, I would say that over the years, especially when it comes to the Middle East dialogue, we have worked on certain principles that eventually got incorporated, for example, in the Vienna II Syria set of principles. We have worked on US-Russia cooperation in Syria that eventually, that's even early, in 2012, 2013, well before there was an official US-Russia cooperation in Syria. And I think some of the understanding in a Track 2 setting within the Middle East dialogue led to some of the official US-Russia interaction. I think the Baghdad Declaration that came out of this dialogue in 2017 at a meeting hosted in Baghdad by the Prime Minister at the time, focusing on what are the principles for a new regional cooperation. I think part of these principles were endorsed at the time by the Iraqi prime ministers and presented as part of his speech when he visited Saudi Arabia. So there has been some official buy-in of some of the principles and ideas developed in different meetings, whether of the Middle East dialogue or of the US-Russia dialogue on the Middle East. But again, I'm going to be the last person to say these ideas, led to this official document or to this official resolution. I think they were floated in the public arena. They were relayed to decision makers, and some of them were adopted in official documents and were espoused by official makers.
You can't really say that we had a breakthrough between 1018 and 1021 right before we had coffee. It's not that sort of a situation. I understand. Paul, I'm just curious to get your takeaways from being involved in these dialogues. What's been the most kind of significant thing for you, high level, obviously not the specifics, but that you've kind of taken away from doing these for a while now?
That's an interesting question. I mean, having done them for a while, I would point to a number of things that are maybe not obvious. One is that the participants in these Track 2s are kind of transformed by the process, because this is a rather unique venue. It is not a government meeting, so you're not coming to the meeting with orders, nor are you coming with blinders and you can't talk about this and you're not allowed to do that. These venues encourage camaraderie or relationship building between what are effectively adversaries. That changes the perspective of people who are generally caught up in their own perspectives on things. Secondly, when you look at it over time, there are people who are in these meetings that end up in power. So they would have learned when they weren't, but then they end up in a position of influence, and they've been educated or almost shaped by this very unusual process that they've been involved in. Also, this is a place where government decision makers or retired or those going in have a chance to interact with thinkers and researchers, which is also something they don't usually do, and to come to appreciate that perhaps ideas, research, creativity might actually be useful for politicians and decision makers. That it's not just, I have my orders from the foreign ministry, I'm going to talk about these three things, and I'm going to go home, and that's going to solve the problem for my country. I think it gives you an appreciation, gives them an appreciation that a lot of these problems are complex, they're long-term, and we have to approach them in a different spirit, in a different way than one normally does.
Randa, you've been involved in Track 2 for quite a long time now, I gather. I'm just kind of curious how that has changed over the time that you've been doing it.
I think there is more appreciation in governments, and particularly in Western governments, especially here in the United States, of what can Track 2 contribute. There is more also appreciation, I think, by Track 2 practitioners of the limits of Track 2. I mean, and so in that respect, that makes for a healthy relationship between Track 1 practitioner and Track 2 practitioners. Track 1 appreciates what Track 2 can contribute, and Track 2 understand their limits. And I think that's very good going forward, because when I started 20 years ago, there was a lot of suspicion on the behalf of Track 1 of what these outsiders are doing or non-professionals are doing, non-diplomats. And then there was this expectations by Track 2 practitioners of resolving conflicts that governments cannot resolve. The second thing is that we know more about what makes Track 2 work and what what doesn't. And so there has been a lot of research in the last 20 years based on serious analysis of Track 2 processes and Track 2 outcomes, interviews with both officials and Track 2 practitioners of the process itself of Track 2. So and as a result of this research, the process has become a little bit more sophisticated in terms of how it is practiced. And I think in the region, there is a diplomacy deficit in the Middle East. But at the same time, compared to 20 years ago, when you talk now Track 2, or when you mention Track 2 to people in Arab governments, you don't say, first, you don't get what is this? And two, you don't get, these are intelligence people who are using Track 2 to gather information about us. And three, there is more understanding or more, I have to say, not appreciation as much as acceptance that there is a role for Track 2, but I don't think there is the kind of appreciation of Track 2 that now we have seen it in the United States.
We should probably wrap things up, but Paul, where do you see kind of Track 2 in the Middle East and MEI's involvement going forward?
Well, sadly, I see a continued need for it because I'm not optimistic about the way things are going in the Middle East. I think the U.S. itself has a big role in the diplomacy deficit that we're experiencing. So we might see a change after the elections in 2020. I do believe that many of the big conflicts in the region between Israel and the Palestinians, and then that would create a breakthrough between Israel and the Arabs, and then between Iran and the U.S., Iran and Israel, Iran and the Arabs. They do need brilliant diplomatic breakthroughs. And diplomacy doesn't exclude pressure and that kind of thing, but at the end, it has to be negotiated out. And I think we're in a time of particular deficit at both the regional level and at the international level. We're also going through a period where the U.S. and Europe and Russia and China are not cooperating at all on the Middle East, and that would be helpful if it were to happen. So, as we were saying in the beginning, Track 2 to be effective needs a Track 1, but in the absence of a Track 1, you still have to do Track 2. So it's kind of a contradiction. We at MEI certainly are committed in the long term, and as Randa mentioned, there might be 3 or 4 other Track 2 initiatives that we're hoping to get off the ground. We're also interested in, addressing some of the emerging potential conflict areas like cybersecurity, which already there's emerging conflict there, and almost people aren't even aware that it's happening. And that could be an area of flashpoint that could be very dangerous and which would benefit from some Track 2, let alone Track 1 progress. So I think we're committed to this in the long haul. I see it as part of what MEI as a think tank is and how it defines itself. Sort of as a think tank / do tank.
Randa, any final thoughts?
I love this do tank. I think it's definitely now it's the moral responsibility, in my opinion, of think tanks, not only to generate ideas, but also to try to see how these ideas can eventually lead to solutions.
We'll have to leave it there, but thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you very much, Alistair.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.